Hello and welcome to Off the Track. My name is Jesse Stevens and I'm joined by Corey,
Hi there.
Riley,
Hello.
and we've got a special guest with us today from Cold Fusion, the world champions in 2012, Spencer Olds.
Hello.
So today we're starting a small mini-series on the different interviews conducted throughout the F1 in Schools World Finals. Today we're going to be discussing the engineering interview and its importance and some tips and tricks about that. I guess we're going to start with the most important and the first thing you should probably do when you're planning your engineering interview, reading the rules. Effectively, the rules are what you're marked against, and the points, they're going to be what allocate the points for you. So if you have to make sure that you're breaking down all the criteria for that quite well. I know Spencer's to give a bit of clarity, Spencer's actually been a judge at I don't know how many national finals now, and I think some world finals.
I've been a judge at basically every national since 2013, yet to judge at the world finals, but I'm well experienced.
So Spencer knows these rules in and out, and also knows what's perfect to do in an interview. So maybe if, how would you go about planning an interview, or what would be the kind of general gist of if you're looking at the rules, how would you break that down, and how would you kind of think to yourself what I should do and what I shouldn't do?
Well, as you mentioned, Jesse, the most important thing is to look at the scorecards and the marking cards and make sure that everything you're presenting, everything you're planning on presenting to the judges is actually part of the scorecards. There's a lot of stuff you can talk about that you might find really interesting, that we as the judges might find really interesting, but if it's not on that scorecard, we can't give any marks to it. And given that you've only got 20, 30 minutes for the entire interview, you definitely need to focus on those scorecards.
So once you've read the rules and you're quite familiar with them, I think there's kind of, I'm not sure if there's 2 or 3 routes you can really go down with an interview, but I think there's more like planning an interview, saying what you're going to show to judges, and then there's more of letting judges ask questions, and then there's kind of like a spectrum of where you put yourself in the middle of that as well, where you kind of go in a bit.
I've definitely seen both ends of that. I've seen some teams come in and literally sit there silently until we ask them a question, and I've seen teams come in with a literal script. And to be honest, I'm not going to argue for or against either. All of them can be made to work, but you do need to be aware of how your team works. Is your team very confident in talking? Are you very happy to take the lead? Or maybe if you're a new team, you're not that sure about it. Don't quite know what you're getting into. It might be better to sit back and wait for the judges to ask questions. I would suggest at the very least coming in and introducing yourself. It's really awkward if you don't do that. But if you want the judge to ask a question, that's fine.
So I think one of the things is to note that the judges get maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes before at most to read what you've got in your engineering portfolio for questions. So if the judges want to ask questions, they're going to either see a blatant error in your portfolio, but if your portfolio is quite good, they're just going to give you very general questions. So maybe that's what I advise, going fully against just letting the judges ask questions. But I think it would be very useful to maybe have something prepared, but let the judges ask questions on the stuff that you've prepared, and making sure you allocate time for the judges' questions. Because if a judge has an unanswered question or doesn't know what's been said, they will not give you the points for it.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, Jesse. If you let the judges take the chance, we're probably going to talk about something you don't want us to talk about. If you come in there and start the conversation, you can steer it towards something you are good about. So, yeah, I mean, as I said, you want to talk about the good things with us, and kind of not letting us talk about the bad things isn't a terrible strategy.
Yeah. I know Riley is currently competing at the Worlds. Do you have any kind of interesting stories or like what routes did you go down, and kind of how did that work for you, and would you change the way you did it?
So the way that we've tended to do it in the past is, with some interviews we've used a script, but generally not the engineering interviews. We find that's kind of a lot more based around the content you have in the portfolio and what's not there for the judges to ask about. But one thing that we do make sure we do is make good use of auxiliary documents and supporting evidence, because I find that that's easily the most important thing when doing your CAD judging and the like, because if you don't have the evidence to show them, your word doesn't mean much.
I think Riley brought up a very good point there. if you're saying stuff without evidence is a big no-no and will lead to judges just asking for evidence. And if you say that you don't have evidence or you forgot to bring evidence, judges very quickly see through that and just
definitely.
think you're lying about it. One of the things on top of that is like the gimmicks. There's a lot of gimmicks that you can kind of bring in that are really cool, like testing gauges or the evidence of your testing, but that's actually unique and interesting to look at. And I've always heard and felt that they go down really well if you've got something interesting to show a judge that hits the criteria. But you got to make sure it also hits the criteria. I'm not sure if any of the boys that have competed have had any special gimmicks, but I'd like to hear maybe about that.
Yeah,
Starting off, maybe
just
Corey.
on that, for our World Finals, we had quite a bit of development with our wheel system. Spend a bit of time engineering that. So not only the wheels, but we engineered a custom, essentially, vice or jig, we called it, yeah. And it essentially allowed us to create some very thin wheels with the tri-spoke design that we went with. And it was quite successful. And as I said, I don't think I've ever seen it anywhere before in the competition. And so the judges actually brought us to that. They went to the pages in the portfolio and they said, can you expand on this, explain this more? And to be able to actually pull that exact jig out that we used for the manufacturing array of showing our wheel development, really aided our engineering judging at Worlds.
Yeah, I think stuff like that really works well to show that you've actually, like, assembly jigs, and that is really good to bring in, because one of the big things that judges notice is that a lot of cars aren't assembled that well. Well, I don't know if I'm just speaking for myself, but that's one of the things that I've noticed. And one of the things that we were very lucky of, we were back in the 2016 era when the LERS was still legal. We were allowed to just bring in all our practice LERSs and all our different concepts and stuff like that, and all our testing parts. And I think showing maybe all the useful testing information and showing why it didn't work and stuff like that's pretty useful as well. And also maybe things that, like, say, I know Spencer's team did a lot of work with like an accelerometer, and they were working on a nozzle, so they actually had quite a few things to bring in as well. So maybe Spencer wants to expand on that.
Yeah, so just as a background, this was back in 2012, a couple of years before the LERS was really sort of came about, and we'd done a bit of testing with a sort of similar device except attaching to the car rather than the launch mechanism. Ultimately, didn't use it because of safety, which turned out to be quite prescient. But yeah, as Jesse said, just being able to bring it in and have the judges physically able to hold something, it's a lot easier to explain something to the judges when they can hold it, they can get a much better understanding of it, and you're wasting less time trying to describe this thing in words that they really should have. The whole discussion about gimmicks is really interesting because, in a way, they sort of serve two purposes. As Jesse mentioned, they should be relevant to the criteria. Everything you bring in should be able to get you a few extra marks in this criteria or move you into advance in this other criteria. So relevant gimmicks like prototype parts, prototype wheels, testing jigs, all things like that are really good. But the other thing from a more human level is that you have to remember the judges are people, and they're probably just as bored, or they're probably very bored at this stage by the time they get to your interview. Bit of honest truth there. So giving them some toys to play with can actually be a really good way of not only sort of tuning them up, but stimulating conversation as well. So yeah, remember that the judges are human. Remember that they're going to want things to do as well.
Yeah, on that, for both Worlds and last Nationals, we brought in a double-sized car, and I know Infinitude had a triple-sized car, and that was, it may not pertain directly to the criteria in terms of getting us points in individual spot in the interview, but it makes it a lot easier to explain certain concepts to the judges and for them, as Spencer said, just to play with.
I know that making your interview memorable is also a very good favor for you to do. If you've got something memorable like a cool gimmick that you can play around with and a judge can play around with, they're going to remember positive things about that interview when they give you a score at the end. Because like, if you're judging and you're listening to 10 different interviews that all roughly say the same thing in different words, you kind of forget what's been said, and you kind of just sit through it, and you don't really have any distinguishing factors. So having that distinguishing factor can be really helpful for a judge, maybe, and it might just give you a few points subconsciously by a judge just being able to think, oh, they've got some more positive memories of that.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely at the end of the day, when we've done all of our judging, yes, we record the scores as we go, but at the end of the day, we do go back and basically remark every team just to make sure that we haven't been biased as we go throughout the day. We haven't given unusually high marks to a team just because they went first. And we will sit there and just rank all the teams from best to worst. And like Jesse says, even something that doesn't necessarily apply directly to the criteria can help us decide we've got these two teams, maybe they're both in second place with the same number of points, and we need to give one team an extra point just so we have a nice, easy ranking at the top. Little things can make a big difference when it comes to those aspects. And if we can remember your team well as, they came in, they had a really cool wheel jig, or, they came in and they really explained their render really well. Those are the sort of things that can get you those one or two extra points you might not think about.
That being said, that doesn't mean that a gimmick is a substitute for anything to do with the criteria that you need to show. The engineering interview will still mainly be focused on all the content that you've produced and all the work you've done. But so don't spend way too much time doing it if you haven't done something that you can bring in. But it's something cool to distinguish you.
Yeah, and just on that, Jesse, something I've certainly noticed become more and more prevalent in a lot of judging and different teams introducing it in the last few years is teams producing their primary engineering portfolio, so the 10, 11 pages that the criteria outlines, but then also producing a secondary folio that is much longer and much more in detail than is in that allowed for that 10 pages, which they can then take into their engineering interviews and provide all of the proofs, the data, and analysis that they've done throughout their entire journey, and really show that they have put the work in and done all of the engineering behind it.
I think there's like, if you're documenting your data well, putting a document like that together and assembling it is a really nice thing and really easy to do. But if you've got like a month before the competition and you don't have any recordings, it's not like I wouldn't like I don't know, maybe Spencer would have an opinion, but what do you think of those auxiliary documents when you get them? Do you think they're very valuable, or do you kind of just look at them and kind of think, oh, yes or no?
It's like what Corey said. They're really great if you've got a really strong foundation. Sort of, in a way, we've gone about this podcast the wrong way around. Really should have started off talking about the fundamental things you need to make sure that you absolutely nail for the engineering interview before you move on to the advanced stuff. So those auxiliary documents, the gimmicks, the toys are great, but if you haven't got the foundational elements there, they're just going to collapse in and they're not going to help support your case at all.
So I guess what so on the point of the foundational kind of tools or like things, what necessarily are these foundations, and how would you go about scoring well in them?
So if I had to boil down all of the engineering criteria into one simple question that I want the teams answered, it basically comes down to the question of how and why have you designed and built your car the way you have? So we want to understand the effort you've put in. We want to make sure that you haven't just whipped this thing up in an afternoon, slapped it in a machine and said that's good enough. We want to see the detail in the decisions you've made, the processes you've chosen, and how you went along this entire 6-month journey to develop your car. So these are things, answering things like talk about your CAD processes, the modeling, the software you used, talk about the testing you used, talk about how that testing influenced the design, and talk about how you manufactured the car, how you chose the machining toolpath. Every step along that way, from blank sheet of paper or blank CAD package, all the way to the car sitting in front of the desk, you need to tell us that story. And once you've told us that story, you can give us the little extra bits, as long as we've got that story as a foundation.
And that story is quite accurately reflected in the criteria. Most of, as Spencer said, it's a journey from start to finish, and the criteria is judged or marked like that. So if you tell it like that, the judges will be able to tick off everything on a list very quickly.
Yes, absolutely. And when you're telling the story, we want to know the whole story and the true story.
Yes. Now, lying in interviews is probably one of the worst things you could possibly do. A lot of teams do it, and a lot of teams try and get away with it. And I've been in the position, both at the states and national level, I don't advise doing it, but we lied about some of the engineering that we had done. And I think there's a funny story that we can tell about this, because when me and Spencer were, because we come from the same school, and Spencer was a frequent collaborator collaborator with our school, and he was kind of I'd say, famous name around the school. So he was actually a judge at my state finals and was doing our CAD judging. And it was kind of funny because I said we collaborated with Spencer in the middle of our interview, not having ever met Spencer before. And just when I said that, I could just tell that like life left his body, because he knew that it was just a big lie and everything had kind of just fallen apart for our interview. And telling a lie like that can instantly just ruin the entire, I think, maybe 20 minutes of information you've just given, because a judge will then start to question every little bit of things you've said. And if they see a tiny hole, they'll be a lot more likely to start going in on that hole.
Yeah,
completely
that
going
was,
through integrity.
yeah, from my point of view, that was quite a funny experience. And I'm glad Jesse can now look back at it, having been a judge, and see quite how wrong he got it.
Yes.
But you raise a good point that, as much as that the judges are here to, we're here to be helpful. We're not deliberately trying to be mean, but part of that job, in order to give you marks, is to try and pick apart your arguments. So sometimes it is as simple as saying, we collaborate with someone, and I'm sitting there going, well, I know you didn't work on that with me. So sometimes it's like that, but it may just be as simple as, you will tell us, oh, we use a Z leveling toolpath to machine our car, and the judge will ask you, oh, okay, can you explain a Z leveling toolpath? And they will go, no, we can't. And that's an example of where they've lied. They've said, we use Z leveling. What they really meant is, our teacher used Z leveling and told us to tell you in an interview that we use this. So lying both in terms of telling the wrong thing, but also lying that you did a particular piece of work when you didn't. It's not good that you didn't do the work, but if you come up and say, we didn't do this, let's move on, it's a far better look than lying.
On the point of judges being smarter than you, I remember at our first state finals, we were actually in a reverse situation where we had complete tradies come in who had no idea about CAD as the CAD judges for that year, because WA States isn't that big an event and isn't very well done. Well, sorry, it's well organised by REA, but the judges aren't always of the highest quality. And essentially, some of the questions that teams got asked were things like, why did you choose to make your car that colour? So in that situation, it's also good to be prepared and have the scorecards on you and make sure that you cover the criteria, because if you get asked the wrong questions and just answer the questions you're asked, there's probably a lot of knowledge that you have that doesn't get shown to the judges, and you may get scored lower than you could have because of that.
That is very good, Riley. I would even go as far to suggest use the words that the criteria uses.
Yes.
That would be a big piece of advice, I could say, because if you say we did this we tried to show, we thought it was an advanced use of CAD, and there's like the line that says what is in the advanced bracket, use that line, because that will be in the judge's head, and they'll see it and they'll just tick it off, because they won't just tick it off, but they're already kind of going into it with a bit of a better mindset, because it's already fresh in their head. Like, they're associating what you're saying with that criteria, unless you say something terrible.
Yeah. One example that stands out to me, which we'll probably cover later on, is one of the advanced criteria is that the results from testing actually feedback and influence the design. And by using the phrase, our testing results influenced our design in this way, it makes it so much easier for us to jump straight up to that advanced category.
On that, make sure you have scorecards with you in the interview, because the judges will have the scorecards there and you may be able to peek and see them, but it's so much more useful if you just have the scorecards there for your engineers to read.
Yeah, you can show them where the marks are.
I think the brilliant part is that engineering interviews, although people won't have necessarily, there might not be people with experience in this competition, but I'm sure most teams will have some mentor that is at some level of engineering background at some point. And if you don't, I would highly suggest trying to get a mentor that's either familiar with the competition or quite technically experienced in certain areas. And maybe go through a mock-up interview of what you're going to go through and get them to mark you against the criteria many times, and then try and see what's right, what's wrong, where you're going to go right and wrong in your interviews. Because I think if you just go to if it's your first time conducting an interview at a state level or national or even a world level, and you're going with the criteria and there might be something blaringly wrong in your method or what you're going to say. So it's really good to get that out earlier, and it's also a really good way to refine the criteria that you're going to get. Like, you won't be able to find out what the judges' questions are going to be, but you might get an idea of the direction of the judges' questions.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely one of the most important things. It's like anything. If you've got a music performance, you're not going to play the piece of music for the first time ever when you walk out on stage in front of your audience. You're going to practice it beforehand. You're going to learn what bits you do well, and you're going to learn what bits you do wrong, because there will be aspects of the engineering judging that don't go well, and the earlier you can catch them and address them, the better it's going to be. I just like to raise a point there with those mock judges, is that don't let your mock judges go easy on you. They'll probably want to go, oh, it's your first time, we want to be easy, we want to be gentle with the marks. But at the competitions, that's not how the judges think. We're here to mark you according to the criteria, and you should get that experience as early as possible, even if it is a little bit painful to be told, yep, you're only a 5 out of 10 on this category.
Yeah, I think that's a good point on that point. And also, don't make sure that the members that are answering your questions know what they're talking about. I know the trend used to be that all 6 members or all 5 or 6 members used to sit on the interview. And I think that was actually a mandatory requirement for a while, but I think that's been dropped now. But I think it'd be a good piece of advice. Just don't have people you don't need in the interview. And if you need them, make sure that they're not answering any of the questions that are getting asked unless they know about the topic. Because get them to either direct questions if they have to sit in, or just don't let them show up about the engineering. But you don't want people to pretty much sit there and just not know how to answer. And kind of, some people get really stressed out in an interview situation and they know the magnitude of it, so they just kind of stress out and start like shutting down and don't know what to do. So it's best to make sure that you have people that know what they're doing, and if they don't, just divert questions quickly.
Yeah, for sure. That's a really interesting point. Yeah. We've got at the competition, our world competition, actually, we had, like Jesse said, all 6 of our team members came into the interview, and despite the fact that 3 of our team were actually engineering based, and there's a great series of photos of our team manager just slowly drifting off and slowly falling asleep during the engineering interview, which I'm sure went down really well with the judges there. But it is an interesting point from the other side of the table as a judge. It's a really good sign for me when I see the entire team walk in and the entire team contributing to the discussion, because that tells me that there's a really good teamwork within the team. There's going to be a big depth of engineering knowledge. There's going to be lots of forms of opinion, and it's a really good setup. But as Jesse said, that is really brought down if only one person speaks and you've got 5 people sitting on the side of the table silent for the entire interview. So it's an interesting toss-up. It's not, if you've got those team members that aren't engineeringly minded, it is never going to be ideal one way or the other. But if you can get them to say something and make that important and make them understand it really well, they can be really valuable. But on the other hand, if you think they're just going to bring the team down, don't be afraid to just ask them to sit this one out. They'll have other skills for other judging sessions.
Okay, so for us at our World Finals, there was the entire team, essentially. And so I myself sat in the middle, and I had the 2 other engineers side by side, and then our team manager on one side and the marketing manager on the other side. And they don't mind throwing curveballs. So I think Vince, our marketing manager, was asked some obscure question about the wheel system development or something like that. Now, Vince, of course, was involved. We all sort of helped each other in all different roles. So he had a reasonable understanding of the different concepts, which allowed him to basically cover the question in general terms good, and then able to redirect it without being awkward as well. So back to one of our engineers, which without it cut that sort of awkward silence out of having someone else having to step in and take over the question. And it also made it look sort of the team a lot more worldly in terms of their understanding of the different elements of the competition as well.
I think that's a brilliant kind of way to do it. I think I don't remember if it was actually Spencer's team. Did you all have something that you could talk about you like prepared something that each team member could talk about in the interview to make sure that everyone kind of had something to say in the 20-30 minutes?
Yeah, so what we did is we had, of our team of 6, we had 3 engineering people. That was fine. We could all talk about our particular areas. But for our 3 enterprise team members, we sort of just in the months leading up to the competition, we sort of effectively trained them up, each on a particular aspect. Our team manager talked a lot about basically the steps in the manufacturing process. Obviously, a manufacturing engineer had the more in-depth knowledge, but she had that, at the very least, she could answer the question about, okay, which manufacturing process do you use? She could answer that question at a surface level and pass it over to our manufacturing engineer. Looking back, I'm not 100% sure if that was the correct way of doing it, but it's certainly a method. And like Corey said, it avoids those awkward silences where no one knows how to answer a question they don't know the content of.
Yeah, so for all good. So for us, what we did was we had when we went into the interview, we obviously introduced ourselves, and after introducing ourselves, we made sure that we made clear like who the 2 engineers were, who would answer the majority of the questions, and myself and the resource manager on our team were also there. And essentially, what we did was we had the scorecards, and when the conversation started to go off topic or the judges hadn't asked about something close to the end, we would kind of just nudge the engineer and go, like, so the judges could hear, would you like to talk about, for example, how we use flow simulation to improve this part of the car? And that kind of way to just get every point on the scorecards hit was definitely, like, I reckon the most useful way to use your enterprise members if you have some in there.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I think that's a really good point to kind of make communicating if someone, because an engineer can often waffle on for a while, so having a way to communicate is a really good idea. You probably know about engineers waffling listening to this podcast, so it's all good. I think how to deal with a setback in the interview would be a good point to talk about next, because there's some questions that you might get where you just have a realization, or I know we had a point where there was just a realization, or it feels like it's just going to go really bad from here, and often that's not the case. It's not going to go terribly bad, but you're getting in that kind of trap of dealing with, oh, you're thinking it's going bad, so I'm going to try and compensate for it or something like that. I don't think it's a good, healthy thing. So I think you should, I don't know, this is just my opinion, and I'll get the other team members' opinions in a second, but treat every kind of question as like an individual kind of aspect, and know that you can kind of recover from anything in all the other criteria areas. And maybe you might take a 2 or 3 hit penalty from explaining something bad, but don't let it affect every other criteria that goes on.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like say, if every engineering interview will have at least one moment where you get blindsided by something you weren't expecting, and you just sit there in shock for a couple of seconds, not knowing how to deal with it. So, how would you sort of, if I had to explain sort of how to dig yourself out of that situation and get back on track? I think the first thing to say is that there's nothing wrong with taking just a couple of seconds to sit back, to process what's been said, and just say, that's an interesting question, and then get into your answer. It will seem like an eternity to you, but to the judges it really won't matter. That might be enough for you to realise, oh, they weren't asking about the thing they thought they were asking about. They've got a much simpler question that I can answer. But if you do get a question you generally can't answer, or something goes wrong, you give a terrible answer, and it feels like everything's fallen in a heap, that point that Jesse made about separating each of the questions sort of into their own mini interviews and not letting them affect each other is a really good point. Because it's a 20-minute interview. We're going to cover a lot of topics. Chances are the judges aren't going to remember that little stuff up you had in minute 5. And even if they do, they're certainly not going to let that affect their opinion of the rest of the questions.
Yeah, I think I've got a perfect example of that from our World Finals. Towards the end of the interview, One of he's actually an Australian judge. The name passes me at the moment, but he looked me dead in the eyes and he said, "So why did you decide to structure this section of the portfolio the way you did?" In just completely stern voice, poker face, and it really threw me for a second. It really hit me with a curveball. But as you said, I took that sort of second to think about the question and just recoup, and I was able to explain how doing it the way that we did enabled us to better explain or better represent what we were trying to get across. And they took that on board, and it was back on the smiles. It just proves that, I guess taking that second and thinking about your answers before you get into it and not just shutting down can really aid you in engineering interviews.
Yeah, judges will feel sorry for you. They won't mark you like that, but they will understand that you're nervous, and they do understand that it's a nerve-wracking thing. So they're not going to be harsh on you if you're a bit nervous. But so you can take that bit of time, and if you're maybe take a bit of time to think, even after every question or anything like that, take 5 or 10 seconds, and you need that. They're not going to mark you down for it because they care about what's coming out of your mouth once you start speaking.
Yeah, another way to mitigate that kind of if something does go wrong, but like if you did answer the question in the way that they didn't expect and it just kind of all falls apart. Another thing we did was that if there were any questions that were like answered by the wrong team member or not enough information and detail was put into it compared to what we actually did, Chris and I, our two enterprise members, were actually sitting on the side and just kind of like marking down and making notes of where we went wrong and what we might want to come back to at the end if we have some spare time. And that worked. And I can't remember what went wrong in our interview, but there was one thing which we came back to at the end, which definitely scored us a few extra points.
We can move on now for some questions for Spencer. What do you think are unexplored opportunities in the interviews? Like, where do you think that there's no teams really stood out, or there's not been too many good teams stand out in an area in interview which is really untapped potential?
Well, I read this question in the podcast notes here. It really struck a note for me. It's quite a really good question here, and I had a bit of think about it. And I think one of the ideas that really strikes me is I'd like to see teams not just explaining, but actually demonstrating their process in an interview. I mean, obviously you can't go to the full stage of design a car in front of me, as great as that would be. But a simple fact of if a team member could say, bring up the flow visualization of their car and point to a new area and say, oh, okay, see how here you can see the flow is doing this particular pattern. I would maybe make this change on the geometry of the car to see if that would help this be more dynamic, or run the FEA test in front of me and point out areas that have high stress. Something along those lines to demonstrate that not only can you talk through and write about the process, I can actually see it right here in front of my eyes. And it wouldn't need to be a big thing. It obviously wouldn't need to go into as much detail as a written formal portfolio. But being able to see something right in front of my eyes is something I haven't seen yet, and I'd be really excited to see that.
I agree with that. I think there's... I had a bit of a think of this question, and I'm not sure if the other boys have any thoughts on it. I thought one step further. It's like, it doesn't... Your engineering design process, I think, is marked independently of the actual design of your car. I know it is in Australia, it's not necessarily in the world's. But if you could spend maybe 5 minutes, maybe say with a simple, say 3D cube or something like that, just going through a design process for a cube and how you would apply it and how you understand the design process for anything and apply the F1 in Schools design process to that cube, you could really show that you tested all like the areas of that. And you could do it in front of the judges because you need a piece of paper, and then maybe you can just do a cube really quickly in CAD or have it ready. But something a lot simpler than an F1 in Schools, just to show that you've followed an engineering design process and how you applied it across the competition, I think could be a really good demonstration.
And even things like manufacturing, you could have for your manufacturing interview, you could bring in different stages of the car and show, like, maybe even have, like, say we use this sandpaper at this point, and just having the physical pieces there rather than just talking about it. That could be really cool.
I remember manufacturing errors are always something that teams should bring in. It's the most valuable thing because it's a test. It's effectively when you're manufacturing a car and an error comes up, that's a good test. and you can show quite easily that you've changed your design, changed your car from one thing to another, or changed your manufacturing process from one to another just by doing that. So that's just untapped potential that a lot of teams miss.
Yeah, definitely. Bring us all your mistakes. We'd love to see your mistakes. Mistakes get converted into marks.
So yeah. So if you break a tool, judges will laugh at you, but it'll be quite fun, and they'll actually understand that didn't work now, but you've got two cars that are on the track.
Yeah, so we had a perfect example of that, as I mentioned, with that jig before. At one point, it was essentially being over-tightened in one certain, on one of the axes, and it was leading to wheels being machined out with a slight shift to the left, so it wasn't perfectly concentric on the inner diameter. And so we were able to bring in those failed jigs and show that the wheels that they were producing, and then show how we changed it and modified the jig to produce our final wheels. And I guess it's a full design process for all of your things, not just your car.
I think we'll move on now to what are the other common pitfalls of a team in an interview? Where does it go wrong for our teams?
It can go wrong very early indeed, Jesse. It can go wrong even before the official interview starts. So in my time out in engineering or interviewing teams, and I will say this doesn't happen very often, but I've had teams turn up late. I've had teams forget to bring their laptop. I've had teams bring a laptop but it's not charged. I've had teams not turn up at all because they got the schedule wrong or only one person turns up. And although there is no point on the scorecard for organisation, it's a really easy pitfall to fall into, to think that, oh, it's not on the scorecard, therefore it doesn't matter. I think something we've implied throughout this podcast is that judges are going to have a subconscious opinion of you regardless of the content you present. And that subconscious opinion is going to either enhance everything you do or stain everything you do. So taking that bit of extra time to, okay, maybe get ready 15 minutes before the interview rather than 5 minutes. Make sure you've got two laptops with your CAD data on it instead of one. Make sure your CAD data is actually open. We've had this issue a lot where teams are using Fusion, being a cloud-based software, and they try and open the file in the engineering interview and find they haven't got internet access. And that means we have to give them a 0 for CAD modeling. So the pitfalls can be those organizational things, not just the content and the engineering side of things.
Yeah, on being late, I've actually got a story about that. So if anyone went to either the 2019 or 2020 Melbourne National Finals for Australia, the hosts, Bosch Australia, actually organised tours around the facility that go for about 30 minutes, and some of them, they say that you have to have a guide to take you from that point in the facility into the other one because it is a manufacturing plant and they have to uphold certain safety codes and stuff. And what happened for our CAD judging was that we had gone on the tour and they started running 15 minutes overtime. And as a result, we turned up to our CAD judging about 10 minutes late. And that really, really cost us in terms of our results.
The other thing to remember, of course, is if you turn up 10 minutes late to interview, that's 10 minutes less time you have to explain the work you've done.
Yep, that was probably the thing that hit us hardest because we weren't able to explain everything and we had to kind of summarize. And since we couldn't go into that much detail, that's why we couldn't hit the advanced points in a lot of criteria.
Yeah, making sure you're there on time and organised is so important. I remember we turned up we had to download our CAD model from Google. Luckily we had it, but it was such an easy mistake that we could have rectified, but we just didn't. And then we had to check. We had to do it in the interview, and that's really embarrassing. And judges will think that, as Spencer said, we think that there's subconsciously we're going to be judging you for not having that. What are common questions that people kind of get in interviews, and how would you go about answering those questions?
Yeah, it's an difficult question because obviously every interview is going to be very different. We're obviously going to structure our questions and personalise our questions based on what the team has done. We're not going to ask you about something you haven't done. It's not very interesting to us and we can't give you marks for it. But certainly the first place to start is we would start by going through those scorecards, going through basically line by line each question and, as you mentioned, ticking them off. But once we get into a bit more detail, certainly some of the questions that we feel like we have to ask as a judge that really should be answered by the team, but we feel like we have to sort of step in and rescue the interview sometimes, is, well, one of the ones that comes up a lot is, okay, you've done all this testing, but how have we actually used this testing to change the design of your car? That's because that's the other half of testing people don't realize, is that a lot of teams will do a lot of testing, and that's really fantastic to see. They'll do their FEA testing, they'll do their wind tunnel testing, they'll do track testing, all amazing stuff to see. But we have to then prompt them to say, oh, so how did you actually use that testing to change the design of your car? And almost every team has done it. That's why they do testing. They all know that, sort of deep down, that that's why they do the testing. But as a judge, we really shouldn't need to ask that. There should be something that the teams explain naturally, and teams want to talk about that. So I don't know, not exactly sure why many teams don't, but if you are a team out there preparing for an engineering judging session, please tell us how your testing has affected your car. We're really interested in that. I might just offer a few sort of closing remarks on sort of having been on both sides of the engineering judging table, is that you, regardless of how prepared you are going to be nervous. Things are going to go wrong. It's not going to be perfect, and you're most likely going to walk out of the interview going, oh God, we've got to talk about this and this and this and this, and it's all a disaster and we're never going to win. And I promise you that it's never as bad as you think it is. When you walk out of that engineering judging session and the judges are still sitting at the table, we will sit there and probably go, oh, well, that went quite well. There are very few teams that do poorly. Most teams do very well indeed in terms of explaining what they know and getting across their information. So, as Jesse said, we do have sympathy for you. We do want to give you as many marks as possible. So come in there as relaxed as you can. Treat it as an informal chat between engineers and engineers. Waffle on, be nerdy, do all that great stuff, but make sure you hit the criteria. And I promise you it won't go as badly as you think it will.
I think that's some great advice for everyone out there. Thank you all for listening. You can listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed the episode, you can rate the show on Apple Podcasts. Apparently, it really helps. We got our socials on Instagram. We're at Off the Track Podcast, and you can visit us at offthetrack.net. Thank you for listening.